Software Leadership with Jonathan J. Tower.
The Azure and DevOps podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using the latest in .NET, Azure, AI, and DevOps. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. The show is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a full-service software architecture and engineering firm. Find them at www.clearmeasure.com. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. A couple of quick announcements. I am hiring, looking for a .NET engineer, any experience level. We're just looking for a really smart and capable C# and .NET software engineer. So send me an email or go to clearmeasure.com for information there. And I am doing another training class with such a great result from the August one. We're doing a AI-driven development dedicated boot camp. Three days in person, Austin, Texas, December 8th, 9th, and 10th. All about AI-driven development with Visual Studio 2026 and .NET 10. And so sign up while the seats last. And now let's get into our guest. We have Jonathan Tower, who goes by Jay, and he's known to friends and colleagues simply as the letter J. He's a Microsoft MVP, Telerik Developer Expert, the founder of Trailhead Technology Partners, a global custom software consultancy. And with nearly 25 years of experience in the industry, Jay has held roles that go from senior architect to director of development. And he now leads a team building high-quality, large-scale applications across a number of different technologies and industries. His expertise spans a lot of things: C#, .NET, ASP.NET MVC, modern JavaScript frameworks, along with mobile app development. But what truly sets him apart is his passion for building community. He's the driving force behind Beer City Code, which is Michigan's largest software conference, and he also serves on the board of SoftwareGR, a nonprofit dedicated to growing the software industry in West Michigan. He's also a frequent speaker at conferences and meetups around the world. He's a LinkedIn Learner course author on LinkedIn Learning. He's a mentor to many through his work with robotics, teams that do that, and other local tech groups. And outside of tech, Jay is an adventurer at heart, and he and his family recently completed a year-long road trip across the U.S., visiting 52 of the 63 national parks. That's a feat. And he's also a fan of photography, hiking, reading, and catching every Best Picture nominee before the Oscars. Well, Jay, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
Very good, Jeffrey. It's great to be here. There's a couple of things I could update in that list of that very long list that you just rattled off there about my life. But I think the most important one is that I've now been to 58 of the 63 national parks.
My number is completely out of date.
That's 58.
Fine. Let's see, we have 5 remaining then.
Yeah, that's right. They're getting harder, the ones that I've got left. So.
Wow. So on that note, do you have a favorite, for people who are like, oh, I haven't even done that? Any, top recommendations?
Yeah, I would say favorite overall is probably Glacier National Park. And then if I was to pick like a clump or a region of national parks, the ones in southern Utah are very special to me. There's a group of 5 there in southern Utah called the Mighty Five that absolutely love.
Wow. Good advice. Well, for those who maybe haven't seen you at a conference or haven't heard you on a podcast, if we kind of go back, you've been doing software for a long time, and I want to explore what is it about custom software that's just kind of kept you engaged and kept you jazzed up where you're still doing it, as opposed to maybe just moved into some type of CTO role at a big IT company.
Yeah, one word: creativity. When I was younger and before computers seemed like a possibility as a career for somebody, I remember in the early 80s, computers were toys that you could maybe get your hands on occasionally, and they were really cool toys and they were very fascinating to me. But I already knew at that point that I was really good at math and detail oriented and all of those things that are kind of engineer on the engineer side of the spectrum, and then I had the desire to like make things. I really loved creating things from scratch, building things, etc. And fortunately for me, in like 6th, 7th, 8th grade, I started to discover that you could do that with software on a computer. You could make things from scratch that didn't exist before. And of course, video games was like an early version of that. And then I tried to create my own operating system because I'm a real nerd, which was, of course, way simpler than an actual operating system. But, and one thing led to another, and here we are.
Nice. Yeah, creating things. The materials. I mean, we could be in construction, building things and creating physical things, but the materials are. It's almost like we're not bound by physics. We can just, the materials are totally different, but so many of the creative parts still come into being.
Yeah, I think we forget sometimes what software, like the term software even comes from, right? But the soft in software is from the fact, is sort of comparing and contrasting it to hardware, which is physical and doesn't change easily. And this is soft and does change easily.
So did we just freeze up on your end? You totally froze up for me.
Yeah, it did.
And I quickly checked my internet connection and mine seems fine. So I wonder if it's Riverside?
I'm not sure either.
All right.
I have a pretty good internet as well, but who knows?
Okay. I'm going to just edit point. I'm going to ask that question again. How about that?
Sounds good.
And hopefully it doesn't happen again, but that's why we have editing. Let's see. I'm going to ask it like, you mentioned creating things. Code is kind of invisible and malleable, and we're not constrained to physics like maybe construction. It is quite a bit different, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I think that's one of the things I really liked about it. We forget sometimes where the word software even comes from, but it's, comparing and contrasting it with hardware, which is hard and doesn't change easily, without a soldering iron or whatever. Yeah. And the fact that you can just like say, I like that, but I want to do it a different way. And, 10 seconds later, you've rewritten a few things and you run it again. It's pretty cool and amazing thing about software.
Yeah. Well, you've gone from being enthralled by computers to writing a ton of code in a variety of different generations of technology over your career. And now, you run a consulting company and you're leading software teams, and other programmers are writing code that you're kind of responsible for. And so, you've moved into software leadership, not just programming, but the leadership of programmers. When did that start, or how does that happen for all the listeners who are maybe younger in their programming career and kind of think, oh, what does my career look like, or what options are there?
Yeah.
What did that look like for you?
I remember kind of in the early days of my career seeing what was happening to the people who were a little ahead of me and thinking like it almost felt like being in the back of a train and watching the front of the train crash into something. Like I was going to have to choose between this, technical track or this management track. And what I realized was that I liked both of those things. And obviously there's only 24 hours in a day. But what that kind of made me gravitate towards was consulting, because even in leadership, particularly owning your own consulting company, even in leadership, you are still, in the technology, you're keeping up on what's going on. Now, sometimes that can feel like two jobs, because it's hard to stay up to date in our industry, especially with things that evolve so quickly, like AI right now. Mm-hmm. But I get bored. Like I've had a couple of times for a very brief period, I've had an internal developer job at a company, which is very easy and relaxing. And, also the stress is more like politics, internal politics, who gets along with who and who's trying to get credit for what and all that. But what I found was generally I got bored pretty quickly because it wasn't going the pace that I was used to. And so consulting was kind of it for me to get both of those tracks in one.
Yeah, that's true. And yeah, very different work routines when you're hired under contract to do something versus full-time employee inside of a software organization. And
That's true.
yeah, sometimes I found myself thinking from time to time. Well, I remember earlier I call it babysitting a software system for 2 years and thinking, oh gosh, what else is out there? Let me be a contractor, and then being in consulting for a long time, there was this stretch of multiple projects per year, which is great. But then it's the thought, man, it'd be nice to see one of those things in a multi-year and hone it and tune it and see it get better instead of moving on. What's it
really
been
true.
like for you?
Yeah, I would say the most common reason that we have someone kind of like amicably leave at Trailhead is because they feel that feeling where they want to see the like multiple generations or multiple versions of something over many years, and like have some sense of ownership in some sort of a software product. And obviously as a consultant, a lot of times you're coming in, you're building something, you're delivering it, handing it off to internal developers to maintain, etc. And then off you go. And sometimes you find out what happens to it. Maybe you come back a few years later and do another upgrade or something, new feature. But sometimes you hand it off and you never, ever hear again what happened to it. And that's can be a little heartbreaking sometimes. So I totally get that.
So on your podcast, you talk about software projects. And for those listeners who maybe have never listened to your podcast, I invite you to tell us what's it about and what your vision, what type of topics that you tackle. But you dive in deep into certain type of software projects and the way to think about it. So what's your angle on that? What are the common points that you stress?
Yeah, the podcast is called Blue Blazes, and that name sort of fits in with the theme of Trailhead. We're like an outdoorsy, hiking kind of oriented brand. Even though software is what we do, you can think of us as kind of thinking of ourselves as coming alongside people on a trail and doing that journey with them and guiding them. And oftentimes when you're on a hiking trail, you'll see these marks on trees that are called blazes. It's basically just like a line of paint that you'll see on a tree, and that'll kind of tell you you're still on the trail. And for different trails that might intersect each other, they'll have different colors, but commonly there'll be blue ones, and those are meant to mark temporary trails that are getting you around some sort of a problem, washout in the trail, tree down, some construction going on, or something that makes it so that you can't go through that way. And so you go around, and that around part, the detour, so to speak, is marked by blue blazes. So that's where that name comes from. And it's this idea that software projects are hard, and there are a lot of detours on them often. And there's a lot of things over the years that people have come up with to try and make them more successful, whether that's, agile methodology or whether it's different tools and frameworks, things like Azure Devops, for example, right? Just like a way to figure out who's working on what and what's next and how long is everything taking. All of these kinds of things are the types of things that we talk about on the podcast. So a lot of tools and technologies, frameworks, technical stuff, and then a lot of like processes and best approaches and stuff as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, some of the projects that you encounter, you inherit some code, or you're going into an environment where there's already software. Of course, it's not greenfield. The industry's gone along too much for that, but so you have existing stuff there, and you got to make something happen. But you've got to design a project that accounts for the lack of perfection in the existing environment. What are some of the most common mistakes or common problems when you go into an environment that just seem to happen over and over and over again? Or maybe if the listeners hear that, they can see, oh, wow, I've got that in my environment. Maybe I can fix that now.
There's a bunch of them. It's funny that you mentioned that, because right now, these days, I'm doing a talk a lot at conferences that is about over-engineering. Mm-hmm. And specifically, it takes sort of an anti-over-engineering perspective. And I basically kind of go through, in my 26 years of experience helping a lot of other companies with their software projects. Like you said, I've inherited a ton of code and started to notice patterns like, oh, this happens a lot. Like a lot of people mm-hmm. fall into the same traps. And so anyway, I've done that talk for the last year and a half now, and it's been really popular. And I think a lot of it is because every item that I go through on that list is resonating with at least one person in the room, if not half of the room, who are like, oh yeah, like I can think of the thing that we're doing right now. So, the shiny object syndrome is a perfect example of that. A couple of years ago, when you and I were talking at conferences, like half the talks, this is kind of like pre-AI, half the talks would be about microservices, right? Mm-hmm. Microservices architecture. And it's a really interesting and cool way to architect distributed systems. But I started realizing that, oh no, everybody thinks that they're supposed to be building distributed systems now, because I'm starting to see so many that are, and I'll ask them what was your motivation to do this in such a complicated way? And they'll be like, oh, we have 100 users. They're all internal. I'm like, what are you doing? It does not need to be so complicated.
And one software team.
Yeah. One small software team of 2 or 3 people or whatever it is. And it just doesn't, like if you go down the list of checkboxes, it's like no on everything, right? And so I created a talk then a few years ago about that was basically like, here's some mistakes that I'm seeing happening with microservices. This is how to know whether you need microservices or not. Mm-hmm. And that was also really popular. But yeah, stuff like that happens a lot. I think engineers get into engineering because they like making cool things, do cool things, right? And sometimes that can accidentally turn into a love of complexity itself. Think like Rube Goldberg type machines, right? Mm-hmm. It's really cool to watch that happen, although it's also really fragile. And so you don't want to build your software systems in a way that's fragile. So avoiding some of those common pitfalls is important.
Yeah. You mentioned AI, and I want to ask you about it, but it made me think of the transition of secretaries over the years. And the reason that comes to mind is my mother-in-law, she earned a secretarial science bachelor's degree, and her career was as a professional secretary. And she's kind of told me, oh, this is the way it used to. This is how it was in the 70s and 80s. And then, of course, the microcomputer came around, and it basically killed the profession of professional secretaries, who they would file information, they would know how to get it, but they did a lot of typing. They did a lot of dictation. And so that was the visible manifestation of what someone did, of what a secretary did was, oh, they do typing. Well, now I have this computer thingamajig. So now the manager, or more than just managers had secretaries, now that they can do their own typing, well, we don't need this pool of people. And I noticed that earlier in my career, I realized, well, shoot, I'm a programmer, but I'm figuring out how to store records. I'm figuring out how to retrieve records. I'm figuring out how to make reports. Well, doggone it, I'm a secretary. That's what I'm thinking. And because my mother-in-law would go over all the courses that she took, and like the practices and everything. I'm like, shoot, we're just putting all those things into computer systems now. Yeah. And so with AI, we see that invariably the amount and the type of code that we write, that we type with our own fingers, is changing and is going to change. And some might think, oh, well, programmers, they write code. And well, now that a machine is just going to do that automatically, now let's change how many or the type of programmers that we have. So with your experience, what do you think is likely to happen to the profession of programming, and what maybe mistakes do you think some companies are going to make? And then, of course, some years later realize, oh, shoot, I need to undo that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think such an important one right now. I think there's a lot of waiting and seeing going on in the industry, but there's also a little bit of, I guess the opposite of that you would call maybe ready, fire, aim kind of stuff going on with AI. So I'm sure you've read some of these headlines too. I've read headlines about Fortune 500 companies that have laid off a bunch of developers and
thousands,
tried to replace them with AI, and had it fail so quickly that they even tried to get some of those same people back. And well, I don't know if any of those people went back. I would certainly not blame them for wanting to have a paycheck, but I also would not advise them to go back to a company that made that decision that way. But yeah, I've had clients come to me and ask for basically like, hey, how should we be using this to, like, can we get rid of junior developers? And, the answer is always, a good engineering answer is always, it depends, right? But like in that client that asked me that recently, I, basically said, well, it depends on what your goals are. Think about like generational knowledge and leadership, technical leadership on your team. Like if you don't have junior developers, like who's going to take over these projects eventually when other people move up, move out, retire, etc. The AI is not going to do that, obviously. But I think AI at a high level, kind of like what you were just describing, you were talking about, secretaries, or like today, I feel like the title more commonly would use the word assistant, executive assistant, administrative assistant.
Yeah, they've come back because we realized, oh, wait, it wasn't just about typing.
Exactly. Yep. When you have an executive whose job, let's say, is in general is to like solve the problems that other people can't solve in a big organization, strategic problems usually, they shouldn't be wasting a lot of time doing whatever the administrivia is, whether it's paperwork or typing or, even getting coffee, right? Like that's stuff that they could be using to do something a little more strategic. And so somebody basically helping them, I think that's the same thing that AI is doing now. And, Microsoft uses the word copilot maybe too much to describe AI.
Yes. Yep. Their branding.
But I think that is an accurate way to think about it. Like this is not meant to be something that happens by itself. You don't have an airplane with only a co-pilot. You have a pilot and a co-pilot. Same thing, right? Like you don't replace people on your team with AI. You give people on your team AI and it makes them faster, better, more efficient, able to spend their time on more strategic things instead of less strategic things. So that's how I think about it.
If there was ever a situation where you could say, you know what, this computer and this software is so good at this particular task, I'm just going to kick off that particular machine and then just let it run and not even pay attention to it, then it would be trains. Now we see some, airport shuttles that they appear totally autonomous because they go from one gate to the other and all that. But there's a person who's monitoring that train. There's somebody in the dispatch center who's actually operating remote control, operate. Even if it has a routine that it goes through, there's still someone operating it. It's not actually just completely automatic. And even, the trains that run across the surface tracks, the freight trains, guess what? There's a train engineer right in the lead car. Like not even those are personless. And we have some, the robo-taxis and Waymo, but there's people that are remote control operating them and looking at the cameras and all that. And so when we look around, that model is well worn. And but yeah, I hear some of the fanciful things about you don't need the person now because we have a machine that's so good. While people who are actually using it to write code, probably throw away half the code. Nope, that's not what I wanted. Let's try again. Nope, that's not what I wanted. Let's try again. So it seems like we're pretty far from that. Even if we are really excited about what it's going to do, there seems to be a lot of fear mongering about, oh, now we have a cooler machine, so the machine is independent. That doesn't seem realistic.
Several years ago, I went to Ford has a F-150 factory on the east side of the state of Michigan that they do tours of, and I highly recommend if you're ever in the area to take the tour because it's fascinating to watch how they do this. But even 6 or 7 years ago when I took this tour, it was highly automated, a lot of robots doing a lot of the work, but there was all people all mixed in with that as well. And then what really sort of dawned on me was I saw a lot of people who were looking at the computer screens related to what the robots were doing and adjusting things. And there was people, there were certain parts that were not functioning that were off for maintenance. And there was robotics engineers working on the robotics. So did a lot of jobs go away on the line? I think the answer is obviously yes, right? But did it create other kinds of jobs for the people who were then maintaining the things that were now doing the work? And the answer, I think, to that is yes, too. So I think AI is probably going to be hard to predict exactly how, but it's going to be similar to that in some way. It's going to replace some people's jobs wholesale, but a lot of other people, it's just going to largely affect their jobs, and other people are going to have jobs creating and maintaining the AIs.
Yeah, I wonder, and I haven't looked at it, how many people worked for Ford Motor Company over the decades, and if ever there was a decade with a technology advance where the number actually decreased the number of people that worked at the company.
Yeah, it would be interesting if you include all the contractors and stuff too. Yeah, that's interesting.
Certainly things change, but there's some fear mongering going around that says, oh, and now here's the cliff. Yep. Mass unemployment versus just, no, this is a technology change for sure. But, and you mentioned robotics. If you recall back to your first programming job, what type of code was it? And how have you seen that code change over the 2.5 decades? Because it hasn't stayed the same, has it?
Nope. The very first job that I had, let's say after college doing programming, was what we now call classic ASP web application and COM objects, if you remember that. DCOM, distributed COM objects. And it felt Windows so cutting edge. It was a .com startup, and it felt so cutting edge at the time. And now I think if I could see that code, it would be laughably simplistic.
Yeah. Well, it was cutting edge because there were some desktop computing only functions or server only functions that, wait a minute, now I can access that from literally any network in the world by just typing in an address in some browser. I mean, that was cutting edge, but remember how hard it was? How hard it was literally just to do a select statement and get some data back from a database or read or write something to a file system. I mean, everything was hard. And now if you literally were to do that today, it's like, oh, let me gather my handful of this library and that library and that library. It's like, okay, I'm done. And now let's move on to something more interesting.
Yeah, to go back to the soldering example earlier, you're basically just soldering some pre-built pieces together and just connecting them to each other now to do those most basic things, right?
I mean, I remember an active server page. It was all about just forms over data, and it was weeks and weeks and weeks of figuring out how to make it happen. And I think I could probably create that from scratch in 3 days today.
Yep. Yeah, and with the help of AI, maybe even faster, right?
Right. Well, we'll talk about that. What type, and you and everybody have been learning it, experimenting with it, seeing what you can rely on it for. What types of things, have you found already are wins in just your types of systems that you work on today?
Yeah. A good example is I just released a couple of courses on DomeTrain, if you're familiar with that. And they're both about migrating legacy applications. And in both of those, I talk a little bit about how you can use GitHub Copilot to help you do this upgrade. So just as an example, in one of them, the UI-based course, I'm talking about the fact that web forms, ASP.NET Web Forms, doesn't exist anymore. When you want to move over to ASP.NET Core, you need to pick some other UI framework. Yeah. A lot of people are recommending Blazor for web forms developers right now. I actually slightly would prefer or recommend higher Razor Pages for web forms developers. It's even a little more similar, I think, to the more server-side processing model that they're more familiar with. But whatever you choose, you can save a ton of time by basically saying, here's this, Razor page in MVC, or here's this web forms page in, an ASPX page that I need to get into some other UI framework technology. Now I could painstakingly move line by line over, and then, maybe I'm really familiar with both. And so I can do that pretty quickly by just saying, oh, this label needs to change to, an inline string, and I'll just write that out from the model, or whatever the similar technology is in the new UI framework. Or you could ask AI, help me do this, and have it do 80, 90, 95 even % of that for you correctly. And then you just go fix a few problems that you see are not rendering correctly, that it didn't do right. And you take a job that could be an all-day job to move that page over and turn it into like a 5-10 minute job, which is huge savings.
Now, you mentioned something that I think is really important. You mentioned choosing the framework that might be the most similar model. And I've, just like you, I've advised a lot of people on architectural decisions and and they're asking, okay, I want to modernize this. And I'd really, all my people are using, technology A. So we'd like to modernize it into technology A. But architecturally, if it's a different architecture, then the reality is, no, we're going to be rebuilding this application. If you just want to modernize it and you don't want to, literally spend the cost of redoing it, well, then we need to pick modern libraries and frameworks that are in line with the existing architecture, like web forms. With web forms, yeah, you might have a little bit of jQuery that runs some things, some helpers on the client, but all of the C# is executing on the server. And so if you pick something where now you don't have all of your code executing on the server, well, that's a different architecture of that UI, and probably design patterns. You have a bunch of business logic tied up in the code behind files that you have to recognize. But anyway, that comes to mind. I think that was a very good point, is choosing the framework based on what it's compatible with.
Yeah. Yep. And a lot of times the human brains involved, that are going to be working on or maintaining this are an important factor in that. If these brains have been for 20 years working on a web forms application, I don't want to say they can't learn something new, because they could, but are they motivated to? Do they want to? I mean, they didn't learn something new and get a different job in the last 20 years. So maybe not, right? Like, it's worth evaluating that and seeing, is this team the type of team that is going to be better off if this is as similar to what they're familiar with already as possible? Or are they maybe chomping at the bit to try something new?
Yeah. Yeah. Now, one kind of final question, pulling back to software leadership again. Let's say we have some managers who are listening, and they run a software organization. What kind of traits do you look for, do you recognize to identify somebody who would be capable to being, so say, a lead engineer or a team lead, or just pick one of the programmers that you say, you know what, let me make them in charge of something, and let me just have let me put a few other programmers under their supervision.
There's a lot of things that need to be on that list, I think, for it to all kind of add up to success. But I think one that maybe gets overlooked that I think is super important. Maybe there isn't a great name for it, but I'll tell you what we call it internally at Trailhead, and that is a sense of urgency. So what we mean by that usually is all of our team leads are the type of people who, when they see something not going the way it's supposed to go, and know that it's going, eventually stuff is going to hit the fan. They are the kind of people who are like, that's not okay with me, and I'm going to maybe go the extra mile, or I'm going to do whatever the maybe uncomfortable communication conversations are to try to prevent that from happening. So they see the train wreck coming, and they are taking the steps to say, like, hey, could we get this train slowed down? Can we change it to a different track? Whatever the analogy is there. So we call that sense of urgency. And, a lot of people, I think that our default reaction is to be overwhelmed or frightened or scared by those things as humans. And so a lot of us have more of a tendency to just sort of say, like, well, it's not my problem, or like we'll worry about that when we get there, or whatever it is. And so that's something that we look for in our leadership team members.
Yeah, interesting. Out of everyone that I've asked that type of question to, not a single one has said, well, they were the best at technology A, or they were the best at technology B, or some techie answer. It was always something else, not just pure tech. So that's good. It's good stuff.
We need good humans, That's what we really need, is smart and capable and hardworking humans that are good people.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Jay, before we go, what else is going on in your world? Any upcoming talks or events that we can make people aware of?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned earlier the Dome Train courses. So if anybody is thinking about doing any migrations, and they would like to, particularly .NET migrations in the web space, like to check those out, that would be great. And then I've got conferences and things that I'm always kind of going to, so people can go to trailheadtechnology.com/events to see where I'm going to be. And then if people want to check out the podcast, it's called Blue Blazes.
Awesome. We'll include those links in the show notes. Well, Jay, thanks so much for coming on the Azure and DevOps podcast and sharing with us all about software leadership. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it was a great conversation. Thanks, Jeffrey.
Well, my pleasure. And until next time, dear listener, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure and DevOps podcast. You can find us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and anywhere you get your podcasts. Visit our sponsor, ClearMeasure, at www.clearmeasure.com. And on behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.